Chapter 10. "Boyle, why are we going?" Gary asked. Electra was detailing the rest of the team on the developments of the day and putting out a call to the ANPR operators for Marcus Bright's car. "Because we follow up every lead," Augustine replied, looking at Gary's position in the passenger seat of his car. Gary had pushed the seat back as far as it went. It looked like he was in the back seat. Augustine was reminded of a teenager who didn't want to be seen with their parent. He hoped that his daughter, Nightingale, would never be embarrassed to be seen with him at any stage of her life.
"Ugh, but we know who it was. Can't we move on?"
Gary inquired, hoping that he could get back to his phone rather than the conversation that he'd started. "We never move on until we pass things over to the CPS, happy and safe in the knowledge that we've put together a watertight case. You know the way I operate," Augustine explained. Gary never liked the way that Augustine operated. It rankled with him that he was working under someone whose methods he had no respect for. Gary looked down at his phone, hoping that something would come up on his Facebook timeline that would keep his interest for the next 15 minutes, which is how long he had estimated the drive to the UPS depot would take. He had only recently joined Facebook, only recently got a smartphone, only recently been interested in the online world. It was his new partner, Agnes. She had changed him in many ways, but his disagreeable work self wasn't one of them. Augustine enjoyed the silence that Gary's attention to his phone brought. It allowed him to stay with his thoughts, working through the evidence they had gathered so far. And all of that evidence was pointing in the direction of Marcus Bright. The DNA, the fingerprints, the murder weapon, and the fact that Marcus refused to come to the station. But the one thing they were missing at that point in time was the motive. Marcus didn't sound like a wife killer. There was no previous criminal record, no reports from work colleagues, friends, family, or anyone else for that matter, of him raising a hand to a living soul. That was why he and Gary were headed to the UPS office. Marcus broke cover to tell him about the van driver. It might lead somewhere. Gary's laughter from the passenger seat distracted Augustine from his train of thought. "What's so funny, Gary?" he asked, not knowing the man to laugh very often.
"It's this Facebook group. Dashcam footage. It always makes me laugh,"
Gary replied, still chuckling at the last clip while the next one loaded.
"Oh, this one's in Washington,"
Gary said, reading the headline before the clip was ready to watch. It always seemed to take an age when he didn't have access to Wi-Fi.
"And it has a UPS van in it too. Now there's a coincidence."
Augustine pulled his car over around 20 yards in front, having first checked the mirrors. The road was strangely quiet. He was leaning over Gary's shoulder, trying to shift his chair back as far as it could go, so he could see. The video was the same scene that Marcus Bright had outlined in their brief conversation. A UPS van covered 2 lanes of the roundabout they were only a few minutes from, over the A19 in the opposite direction. The video was captured by the car behind the one Augustine now knew belonged to Marcus Bright. It matched the description and registration he had been given earlier. The van then waited until the lights had turned from green back to red before racing off across oncoming traffic. Horns sounded, tires screeched, and bad language was hurled out of the windows of vehicles. Then the UPS van was off and away. The clip stopped. "Well, let's get to the UPS depot and try to clear this up," Augustine said, looking over his shoulder and indicating that he wished to rejoin the flow of traffic that had suddenly become much busier than when they were stopped. They were there in under the 15 minutes Gary had predicted. Both men seemed to jump out of the car, meaning business, and both were at the door of the office, knocking on the glass top half of the door. The receptionist looked up from her desk and buzzed them in. "Can I help?" she asked while the door was still open. Her voice was muffled by a lorry leaving the depot, revving their engine. "'Excuse me?" Gary asked. "Can I help?" the receptionist asked again, this time with the sound travelling from her mouth to their ears without distraction.
"I hope so,"
Gary replied, flashing his badge. Oh, can I help, officer? She corrected herself. Detective, Gary said, by way of second correction. Can I help detectives? She asked, looking at Augustine for some reason when she got none from the man who had spoken so far. Augustine flashed his badge too. I'm Detective Boyle. This is Detective Hall. We'd like to ask a few questions about one of your drivers and one of your vans, if we may. Who's the best person to speak to? I'll try my best. I'm Marcy, by the way. It's funny, you know, we don't often get people asking about our vans or our drivers, but you're the second today, and you sound far more official than the last one. Did the person come here? Augustine asked, with an urgency in his voice. No, it was on the phone. When I asked for his details, he hung up. I'd love to give you his name, detectives, but I don't have it. Don't worry about that. We already have his name. But enough about him. Back to the van. Gary, show her the clip, Augustine instructed. Marcy leant over the reception desk and peered into Gary's phone. The clip was only a minute long, but it confirmed the tale the mystery caller had made earlier in the day. She looked at the registration. It was the same as the one she had been given over the phone by the mystery man. The note on her desk was still there with the number written on it. This isn't our van. I've checked further. This doesn't belong to our company. You can tell from a few of the decals that it isn't us. The P on the logo doesn't have a long enough tail. It's kind of our thing. The P reaches down towards the bottom of the UPS shield. This looks like it has been printed by someone else and attached to a brown van. And that's the other thing. I can't vouch for the quality of the video, but the brown on here doesn't match our brown, Marcy said, pointing to the still image she'd paused on the screen, as she explained. So, what are you saying? Augustine asked, making eye contact. This is someone pretending to be UPS. It's not the real thing. Fuck, Gary said, under his breath.